Okay, welcome to the end of Thursday. If you want to get me really annoyed, you should refer to this conference as the antivirus conference, because I really think it isn't. But at the same time, the fact is, a lot of people here work for antivirus vendors or endpoint security vendors. And I think it is, and in this landscape, a lot of things are changing, so I think it's important to have a discussion about these changes. And I'm very excited to introduce Adrian Sanabria from 451 Research to talk about these things. Thank you.
Thank you. And you do have virus in the name of the conference. So that's, you can't get too upset, I don't think. All right, thank you for coming in today. Late on the second day of the conference. I've been on the last day of the conference, the last presentation, and that's not the best time to be there. But yeah, so I actually emailed sent Martin an email and asked about if this industry would be interested in doing something. I think we tend to stay within our bubbles too much. And while some issues it is important to stay close to them, I've always been a big picture guy. And that's one of the reasons I love being an industry analyst. It allows me to spend all day thinking way too much about all these topics and how they fit into the other topics. And that's what I want to share with you today. So just to give you a background, I don't know about the average industry analyst, but I've been on the defense side, I've been on the offense side, I've been a PCI QSA, I spent 5 years of my career as a chief incident handler. I was in IT before that, so I've been a sysadmin. I've done architecture. Generally I jump at pretty much everything and anything I can get my hands on. So we're going to start out with the big picture. So and this is typical of security. Security is a second layer on top of technology and everything else. And it's just the nature of security. And I don't think the financial markets have understood this yet, have gotten this yet. If you look at FireEye's stock prices and things like that, disruption has to occur. A lot of times we don't know that we've picked the wrong route or the wrong technology until we're several years down it. The startups have been built, sold, the money's been pumped into it, and sometimes just the landscape changes. It's not that we made a mistake, it's just that things change, new technologies come out, and old strategies don't work anymore. So a lot has changed. And I think one of the most important things, I'd say two very important things have changed here. The user and how they use technology and the technology itself has changed, and the attacker has changed significantly. So I think there's a lot of gaps here, and I'm going to get into these more. I don't want to spend too long on these overview slides, but if you were to step out of the room right now, I think that this gets across some of the key concepts and ideas I'm trying to get across here. There's a lot of key things we don't think about when we build security solutions. We don't think about the user. We don't think about where it's going to be used, where that user is going to be, and how they're going to use it. And then we don't think from the attacker perspective well enough, I think. I think it's too easily, and I don't have that XKCD comic in here, but the Hollywood versus the real life. In Hollywood, there's some very creative and sexy ways that you can break into systems, and then there's, you look at the attacker mindset, and they want the paycheck as easily and quickly as possible. They're not going to go for the coolest story to tell over beers. They're going to go for money in their account. So the market view here, it's very difficult to, even as an industry analyst, to keep up with it. So backing up, if we look at the history of endpoint security here, AV was kind of the key product in 2002 and before. And then we started to see it branch out. And we saw a lot of additional technologies, and they don't even fit in the bubble here. But we just saw, and this is a classic security startup market. This is a classic security cycle where it just breaks out like this. And even today, I think a lot of people don't recall that money was actually spent on host-based firewalls because Windows didn't have one, Mac didn't have one. They weren't built in. If you wanted a firewall on the OS, you had to buy it. Because it was, it hadn't become ordinary for laptops to leave the enterprise, for most of the employees to take a corporate device and plug it in places that weren't trusted, networks that weren't trusted. We didn't need a firewall there. So a lot of these got consolidated. Then we ended up with something we called endpoint protection. Then in 2010, we saw some significant changes in the attacker. It's not that the attacker changed in 2010, it's that we became aware of the landscape change in 2010. So again, we had this explosion. AV wasn't stopping a lot of the stuff, and we just had other needs. The ways the attacks changed required us to defend differently. Back in 2004, I was responsible for my company's SIM. And one of the things I looked at doing was just taking the Windows logs from all the workstations and putting them into that SIM. And of course, it was a large payment processor, so we had to comply with PCI. And that means keeping your data for a year is one of the requirements. And just putting the Windows logs, not even what CrowdStrike and Carbon Black and these guys are talking about doing today, taking every network connection, every file change, what's accessed the file, process tree in memory. This was just Windows logs. I would have had 3 weeks of storage after pulling them all in there. So that changed. It was able to change primarily. Now we have NoSQL, we've got Hadoop, we've got solid state-based SANs, things like that. The storage and the data technology enable us to do that now. It didn't 10 years ago. We couldn't have done that 10 years ago. So again, we're right there again. We're seeing heavy consolidation, and when I released my report, I'll show you here in a moment, the one I wrote last December, I had 5 categories in there, and I noted in the report that I fully expect 2 or 3 years from now to only have 2 categories, to go from 5 down to 2. So I don't know what we'll call the next thing. I work at 451. I don't work at Gartner. They'll come up with that term. We'll all have to use it. But I hope it doesn't have next generation in it. Because I don't know about you, but that term's, I think, outlived its usefulness by now. It's a term that expires, What do you have after next generation? What do you call it? If Palo Alto Firewall was next generation in 2006, what do you call it now? Also, a little jab at machine learning there. I think the marketing has taken to referring to machine learning and AI as equivalent things, so I had to take a little jab there. Another one of my feeble attempts at humor, the attacker landscape. So this was 2003. This was my boss when I joined 451. I quoted her saying this. I'm not sure if she's happy with me quoting her saying this. But it's important to understand, when we were talking about the death of antivirus, we were really talking about the process of doing detection and doing prevention, not the market, not necessarily the products. Again, it's just this change that we have to make in how we do this. And I've publicly gotten out there. Netflix made some PR statement about the death of AV. I said, no, just because we're doing it differently, just because we're stopping malware differently doesn't mean that it's dead. But maybe again they're using the other definition. Maybe they're talking about the fact that the process has changed. So it is all about the process. Now we live in a world where malware is completely disposable. There's no reason to use binary executable file with this particular hash more than once. Part of the malware kit is it'll generate something unique that's guaranteed or literally your money back to bypass AV. And once you're done with it, you dispose of it. So we've had to move on. One of the things that irks me is a lot of companies out there have advanced products and then they're non-advanced products. The way I look at it is we have things that work better and things that don't work as well. So to me, I somewhat jokingly ask companies, are you going to charge people for the patch, for the upgrade here? Because all this is doing is what the original product was designed to do. So why sell them even as separate products? This should not be marketed as a premium product because this is just how it is now. The attackers have access to things we consider advanced, and it's no more difficult for them to use them, so they use them. So another term I want us to get out of using. These things that were, maybe they were advanced in 2010, but it's not 2010. So what I call the first great endpoint security consolidation started with Zone Alarm in 2003, Checkpoint acquiring Zone Alarm, which was a host-based firewall product. I think it did some additional things, some IDS, IPS. And roughly, it's kind of hard to tell exactly where it ends, but whitelisting was big in the late 2000s, and there were some key acquisitions there like SolidCore, and then Symantec acquired PGP, which one of the key pieces of endpoint protection was full disk encryption. This was before we had BitLocker, before Mac had, I'm going to blank on the name, but Windows, Mac, host firewalls, full disk encryption, all these got built into the OS. And really, if you look at this trend, what's a feature today, Emmet, AppLocker, ends up as part of the OS. So we just end up with a more resilient, more security feature complete operating system as we go down the line here. It makes sense to ship with a lot of these core key technologies we need to keep these systems safe. So that was about 30 acquisitions over that time period, just for endpoint security. And so several events helped us kickstart the second consolidation, which started also in 2010. I think whitelisting was a big one of them. I think a lot of people got keyed up over whitelisting. There were big marketing campaigns saying that whitelisting could replace AV, and solve that problem forever. And even technically, if it could, I think what a lot of us, certainly a lot of the vendors didn't count on was that, again, what I said at the beginning, the users. They didn't take the use cases, the workflows into consideration. And anybody who tried to do this, blanket-wide across the entire operating system, all executables, all employees in the organization quickly found out that it wasn't something that was maintainable. So what happened after 2010? We found out about some super cool malware created by governments, highly funded, some other state actors, Snowden, so some NSA tools and toys made it out of the toy box and into public. So all these things, once you use a piece of malware, once somebody spends all this money, whether it be state-sponsored or just a single malware author, it's very difficult to use those tools, to use malware, to use these, whether you want to call them tools, weapons, whatever, and not have them get in the hands of people that will take them, build on them, and go from there. And then ransomware has been the big one. I remember, a decade before we first saw ransomware, chatting with people and wondering, why don't these guys just, automate something really destructive? Why don't we see more of that? And we have started seeing that. And it really is like when we can come up with these scenarios, You know, it's not that it's not attractive to them, they just haven't figured out how to monetize it yet. So ransoms, extortion, has been going on since we've had broadband, you know, since before that, you know, related to servers and computers and things like that. Ransomware is just the first time we've seen somebody come up with a better way to monetize it and fully automate it. So they've scaled it up. Right, so the second big endpoint security consolidation, a key one we saw, Webroot acquired a company that had some technology, allowed them to do detection without depending on signatures. So that was a big turning point there. We started seeing more and more of that. Google acquired VirusTotal. Avast and AVG was a good one. And your joke was excellent, by the way. About the, let me know if the acquisition helps them with their foosball game. Or you call it table soccer? Yeah, table football. Table football. That's right. Only we call it soccer. So that's 26 acquisitions so far. We're going to see several more this year before the year's even out. And we'll see a lot next year. Because we're now up to something like, I think I tracked 77 endpoint security vendors. And that actually excludes some things that you might call endpoint security. So here's some statistics we gather at 451. Clearly you can see here, a lot of people are piling up solutions here. They're not using one endpoint solution here. And it's because of this fragmentation, the fact that we have so many products that do niche things. And also, as I mentioned before, the first great security consolidation, you know, created this monolithic endpoint protection client. Most of the new guys that are maybe more effective at catching malware aren't doing any of those things. They're not doing full disk encryption. They're not doing device ports control over your USB ports. They're not doing all those extra features. So one of many reasons we might be running more than one of these. And we actually captured some of that. Here's some of the things that people that we survey. This is a part of 451 called Voice of the Enterprise that surveys, I think for this one it was something like 900 buyers in the enterprise every quarter. So we get some great data out of there, and you're going to see more of it. So last December, this is what my market map looked like. I broke it out into 5 categories, and as I promised, I've already consolidated down some from this. But it's extremely difficult, I think, to build these categories. I'm confused, the buyer's confused, even some of the vendors are confused over how to break up their products, how to sell it, who the buyers might be. And part of my job to guide them on that, and sometimes I have to say, you know, I'm not sure. You're going to have to fill this one out. So this was 62 vendors. This was 10 months ago, 5 categories. And now I'm kind of down to 3 categories, and we're up to 77 vendors. And what we're seeing a lot of is we're seeing a lot of vendors with some cool tricks, you know, but not much more than a cool trick to stop malware. You know, maybe they shim writes to the kernel. Maybe they look for certain syscalls or patterns of syscalls. So again, they're shimming the kernel to do that. A lot of people have found these little tricks to catch malware, but they're tricks that could be evaded, and it's not really a product. You know, they're going to try and sell it as a product, but it really should just be one technique used within a larger product. And again, this is normal for security. Most startups in security are building features that are destined to become features in larger products later on. And financially, I mean, that's just that's the way it is. You know, you can't boil the ocean when you're a startup and you have limited funding and capital and access to talent. So we also see a 50-50 split between complementary and primary. And what I mean there is there are products out there that are meant to be installed alongside AV, and then there are products that are meant to replace it or to be that primary product. So that's a 50-50 split right now. And that was complete coincidence that it's exactly 50-50. Well, actually, it can't be. That's I've got 77 vendors. Probably a few of those, I'm not sure. You know, I have to do more research there. So primary, we've got pretty much two things here. And to be a primary vendor, again, if I'm a PCI company, they've got to be certified AV, or my QSA is going to say, no, that doesn't count as antivirus. You can't use that. Whitelisting, can get past that sometimes, but, really that AV certification is very important. It's a waterline that they've got to cross for legitimacy. A lot of these products, there's no free trial. There's no way to grab it, download it, look at it, play with it. So we have to depend on some kind of system here, to give us some confidence that this does what it says it can do. And so we're just now starting to see, I've got a list of 4 there, of these next-gen AV companies that do that. So talking about next-gen, I don't know what Gartner's definition for next-gen AV is, but the way I generally think of it is we have products that require prior knowledge of a threat to stop that threat, and products that don't require prior knowledge to stop a threat. So in my mind, that's the clear distinction between the two here. Anything I'm going to consider next-gen does not require IOCs or signatures or a malware sandbox to take 5 minutes to analyze it. I think static analysis is fine, because you have to think about the use cases. I think a malware analysis sandbox is fine for email because a 5-minute delay on email isn't a big deal. But if I'm browsing the web, if I'm downloading something, if I've just plugged in a flash drive, I can't wait 5 minutes, for a malware sandbox to run that. So that technically to me, even though you're the first one potentially to analyze it, you have to turn that into, yes, it's a known threat, no, it's not a threat, before you can take action on it. So, prevention and detection. The difference between these is pretty significant, and I think what the market is really striving for right now is prevention. And the big difference here is prevention just stops malware from executing. End of story. You just go on with your day. You don't have to analyze it. You don't have to spend any time on it. Product just did its job, and end of story. User goes on with their day. If you don't have time, you don't have to look at it. Whereas on the detection side, it's much more expensive because you have to launch into your incident response process. And anytime you have to kick, security team in gear, maybe you want to reimage that machine after you're done with it. A lot more labor involved with that workflow. So big distinction between the two. And most enterprises I talk to, their hair's on fire 24/7. So they're really looking for the prevention side of things. And once they get that down, once they have less infections on a regular basis, and they get that tied down, we definitely have to move in the detection route because things will get past that. I don't think it's important or even necessary to go for 100% prevention. At some point we've got to have that layer further down to catch things. So data collection, that's where this comes in. We've got all these products that just gather tons and tons of data from the endpoint. And I think it's, I see a lot of enterprises trying to compare prevention products and products that just pull all this data from endpoints. And it's just, it's night and day. If you've got infections going on 24/7, and you never come out of incident response mode, you don't need more data at that point to have to comb through. That's not the right move there. And generally those attempts fail because they do not have the extra people to look through it, to tune it, to monitor it, to manage it. And that's why we see a lot of managed services around this now. Red Canary is a company, they do nothing but take your carbon black data and tell you if something bad is in it. That's all they do. They go through all that noise for you and pull out the signal. So another big thing to mention here, a lot of the newer guys don't do a whole lot with remediation. And the term remediation here, I want to be clear on. When I think of remediation, I think of actually cleaning it up. You're actually undoing registry keys that were set, pulling files off the system, unregistering DLLs, whatever the piece of malware did, you're undoing it. versus containment, which a lot of people use the term remediation to refer to as an incident responder, what I think of as containment. That's just keeping it from exfiltrating stuff, talking to C2, spreading to something else. If it's a worm, that's just limiting your damage, which is very useful in the moment that you detect something bad is on your systems. But beyond that, you still have to clean it up eventually. And it's very, very expensive, as I mentioned, to take a system from somebody, pull it back to the help desk, copy the data off, re-image it, copy the data back on, hand it to them. And my estimates is anywhere from $800 to $2,300 every time you do that to an employee, depending on that employee's salary, your security analyst salary, your help desk people's salary, all the time necessary and labor necessary to do that. So the startup cycle, switching gears here a little bit, important to understand that at some point here, most of these, I'd say 95% plus startups are going to be acquired by somebody. The founders are going to leave at some point. Very important to understand if you're in a startup, dealing with a startup, using a startup's product, because it can be disruptive to the customer. Some customers prefer to wait for the consolidation to happen. Other companies, like you see Netflix, will try one of everything. Anything new that comes out, they actually have the bandwidth to try some of it. And they'll give good feedback, and it's good for the startup community. And generally, it's a 3 to 5 year cycle is what we see in security. From the start of a market to most of the consolidation having happened. So here's my roadmap for security. And honestly, this actually might be a good place to stop because I've got a ton more slides, but it's really mostly an angry rant from me. So maybe I can give the other part of the presentation in a bar later. But this is kind of the key here. So this is, I promised 5 years out. This is really, and I've formed this over, several years doing this. Really my whole career, just thinking about it. So all of this is happening right now. This is not going to happen linearly in this order. Companies every single one of these steps is happening now. But I put this in this order because I think this is the order that makes the most sense for the average enterprise out there right now. What their capabilities are, what they have available. And like I said before, it doesn't make sense, to get terabytes of new data every week, when you're just trying to stop the infections. So the better malware mousetrap is definitely what we see most of those 77 vendors doing and really, really focused on, and just a broad number of different ways to accomplish that. AV certification is obviously important for the market because a lot of people can't buy it. They're not going to be able to use it unless that certification is there. Standards, regulation, stuff like that requires it to be something that's had some kind of due diligence, third-party due diligence done on it. Non-malware attacks. We could solve malware today, be done with it, have a 100% solution for it, and attackers will still get on systems. So we clearly have other issues we have to do there. Somebody earlier was talking about, they call it CFO fraud. It's, I guess, a new term, but the idea that, if I'm an attacker and I want, there was the case in Austria where I think it was an airplane parts manufacturer. Attacker just sent the CFO an email requesting 45 million euro to be moved from this bank account to this bank account, and he did it. There was no link, there was no attachment, there was no exploit. It was just 100% social engineering. And really that you have to get down into thinking about the entire workflow of how we use computers, email, things like that. Because transferring 45 million euro is not a workflow that should exist in a company of that size within email. There should be some other system, some other workflow for that. And email gets abused for that kind of thing. So that's for a defender, that's a different way of thinking about things. Then, of course, the endpoint protection features. There's a lot more we need on the endpoint. than just malware or even just attack prevention. So these features are going to have to make it into whatever product we end up using. And I think eventually we'll see a shift where the enterprise is not comfortable with having 2 or 3 vendors, separate invoices for each product, separate control management consoles for each product. They're only going to deal with that temporarily. So we're going to have to see that consolidate. And then data visibility. I think this one is huge, and it's been avoided because it's a very, very hard problem. We have a lot of products that can tell us if an infection occurred, but very few of those products can tell us what was taken. And that's incredibly important because generally, if that happens, the default for a company is to assume the worst, and so they buy all their customers' identity theft protection. They assume all 7 million records were lost. But if we had a product that could tell us exactly what was taken, if anything was successfully exfiltrated, maybe it was only 7,000 records, or 7 records, or no records, and we don't have to enact the breach protocol at all. We don't have to go through that workflow at all. And I think that's going to be very, very attractive to companies. And ultimately, I think the direction we need to move in is aiming to not need separate product in the first place. We saw that with a lot of these features, with host firewall, full disk encryption. I don't have to buy a third-party product to do that. Android, iOS, the average person, I think, does completely fine on those platforms, even Mac without antivirus. Generally, if you make a few precautions, you don't have to do it. So, Windows is kind of the special child here because there's so many legacy requirements, so many components, and I think there are signs that we're getting there, though. Recently, they opened up their App Store, which I think having a centralized App Store is one of the key ways, that you increase the resilience of the platform and you keep bad stuff away from it. And Microsoft just opened their App Store to external full applications, not just the cross-platform mobile applications that have been the only thing on there before.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.